Welcome back to Phil 110, Human Nature. This is the fifth lecture of the course, Friedrich Nietzsche on Morality and the Death of God. Last time we talked about Karl Marx and Marx's problematization of discussions about human nature within philosophy up until that point, specifically through his critique of classical political economy and Hegelian philosophy and the like. And today we're going to talk about Nietzsche, who, along with Marx and Sigmund Freud, who are not reading in this course, is considered to be part of the tradition a loose tradition rather, known as the hermeneutics of suspicion. And the common thread that connects the philosophers within the hermeneutics of suspicion, again, Marx, Nietzsche, and Freud, is the rejection of this 19th century idea that society is organized coherently, right? And that sort of the pieces of the puzzle that makes up society fit together cohesively. Instead, what philosophers within the hermeneutics of suspicion try to set out is that society, in fact, is characterized by discord and conflict and antagonisms. And just as there are different layers of what we that make up what we call society, there are different layers of what makes up what we call human nature. To start with, Friedrich Nietzsche, like Marx and like Kant, was born in Prussia, or what is today Germany. He was born in this town called Raaken. And he was the son of a Lutheran pastor who died when Nietzsche was very young, at 4 years old, and which obviously had a profound impact on Nietzsche's early life. And Nietzsche originally wanted to be a musician, specifically a composer, I believe. But he was always an amateur one and never really succeeded that much in his musical career. So after his brief stint with music at a young age, he went to the University of Bonn to study theology and philology, wanting to become a Lutheran minister, just like his father. Philology is kind of an archaic discipline, still around today in many senses, but philology or philologists try to trace the origins of the meanings of words within texts, right? So similar to etymology, which tries to find out how words or concepts are developed. But during his studies at Bonn, Nietzsche encountered the works of German pessimist philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer, which changed Nietzsche's intellectual life forever after that. And Schopenhauer was known at the time for kind of taking elements of what we call German idealism or post-Kantian philosophy and putting it in conversation with his exposure to Buddhism and Hinduism. So Schopenhauer was one of the first European philosophers to take seriously spiritual, religious, and philosophical systems from the Asian context. And the TLDR of Schopenhauer's philosophy was that he believed that the world is composed of these ceaseless and directionless wills, right? So we can think of wills as like the striving toward. But the thing about these wills is that they can never truly be satisfied. And because they can never be satisfied, that results in perpetual suffering because life is ultimately devoid of a final purpose. So if you're at all familiar with Buddhist philosophy, you can definitely see where the Buddhism comes in within Schopenhauer's beliefs. When Nietzsche was only 24 years old, he took up a professorship at the University of Basel in Switzerland. And right before he left for Switzerland, Nietzsche renounced his Prussian citizenship because he was very frustrated with what he saw as the rise of German nationalism and anti-Semitism. And Nietzsche preferred to sort of identify himself as a cosmopolitan European rather than as, a provincial German. Around this time, Nietzsche also befriended a very famous composer named Richard Wagner, who I'm sure many of you have heard his music, even if you didn't know is Wagner. Wagner wrote, for example, The Flight of the Valkyries, which is a very famous tune in contemporary culture. But eventually, Wagner and Nietzsche had a falling out because Nietzsche was frustrated by Wagner's attempts to kind of inculcate the sense of German nationalism with anti-Semitic overtones within his musical works. And Nietzsche thought that that was a huge affront to what good culture should look like in a European context. But for the rest of Nietzsche's life, he lived a relatively lonely and sickly life. And in 1899, that should say 1889, not 90. In 1889, Nietzsche had a mental breakdown, allegedly after seeing a horse get flogged in the streets of Turin, Italy, where it was reported that he went up to the horse and hugged its neck while it was falling down, yelling and screaming, saying that he understands the horse's suffering. There's various theories as to why that happened, including the idea that he contracted syphilis when he had sex with a prostitute. Another theory was that he inherited his father's brain disease, the same brain disease that did kill his father at a young age. Or probably a little bit more kind of mythically, that Nietzsche went mad because of the conclusions of his own philosophy. So after Nietzsche's famous breakdown, he spent the last 10 or 11 years of his life incapacitated in his sister's quote unquote care. And we'll talk about why that's in brackets here in a second. And some notable works by Nietzsche include The Birth of Tragedy, which is his first major work as a philosopher, The Genealogy of Morality, a section of which you read today, The Gay Science, Beyond Good and Evil, and Das Buch Zarathustra, which also you read the beginning of. Nietzsche's legacy. So again, during the last decade of Nietzsche's life, when he was spent infirmed, his sister appropriated and doctored all of his philosophical writings to make it fit with the rise of German nationalism and anti-Semitism, even though Nietzsche was very explicitly against German nationalism and German anti-Semitism. So she'd, get rid of or omit entire passages where Nietzsche goes after German nationalism or anti-Semitism. She'd even just make up crap, write stuff out of fiat and put it within Nietzsche's writings as if it was his own. And Nietzsche's sister, who was named Elizabeth, was renowned for being a very rampant anti-Semite, even for German standards at the time. At one point in her life, she and her husband at the time tried to start a anti-Semitic or Jewish Free German colony in South America, which ended in financial disaster. And I believe that Elizabeth's husband committed suicide after the financial hardships that they accrued during their attempt to start a colony. And eventually, in her later life, after Nietzsche was long dead, Elizabeth became acquainted with Adolf Hitler, to whom she gifted Nietzsche's favorite hiking stick. And during Nietzsche's interment, she would make money by showcasing her brother, displaying him out as if he was a zoo exhibit to paying visitors. And it's reported that Nietzsche, again, he was completely incapacitated. He could not feed himself, could not take care of himself, could not talk that much. He lived a life of suffering his last decade. It would be said that when his sister will do these things, he would cry out in agony and cry out in frustration, but he couldn't really do anything about it. So because of his sister's attempt to doctor Nietzsche's writings, Nietzsche's philosophies gradually became identified with Nazi ideology. And they they misread aspects of Nietzsche's philosophy to be supporting an anti-Semitic or racialist philosophy. So for example, concepts like the will to power, master morality, or Übermensch were appropriated by the Nazis and reinterpreted in a direction that Nietzsche didn't want it to go. And the 1934 Nazi propaganda film, The Triumph of the Will, which features, Hitler descending from this airplane onto Germany as a sort of messianic figure of the German people, and is portrayed as an Übermensch-like figure. That film was inspired, allegedly, or not allegedly, it was inspired by Nietzsche's book, Das Buch Zarathustra. And after World War II, Nietzsche's philosophy became unpopular because it was associated with Nazism. But luckily, and then his books were banned in the Soviet Union and other communist countries because they thought that his works were allegedly promoting Nazi ideas. But luckily, due to the concerted effort of various American and French philosophers especially, they were able to rehabilitate Nietzsche and saw that, he wasn't a Nazi propagandist, or he didn't forward Nazi ideas. And Nietzsche was, at least himself, far from being an anti-Semitic or racialist thinker, at least in the same vein as the Nazis were. especially philosophers like Walter Kaufman or John Paul Sartre, who we're going to talk about next time, made this effort to rescue Nietzsche from Nazism to moderate success, I would add. That being said, though, it's not that Nietzsche himself is entirely innocent. I mean, there are certainly aspects of his philosophies, even before his sister doctored his writings, that lended credence to certain aspects of Nazi ideology, even though that wasn't necessarily what he wanted to support in his writings. And we'll see that kind of soft complicity show up here maybe in a second. Okay, so the genealogy of morality, which you read yesterday, is written as a critique of Judeo-Christian morality as well as the English moral genealogists. And moral genealogy, at least at the time, referred to these group of philosophers who attempted to find the origin of how morality or moral concepts developed from not just psychological motivations, but from a variety of different factors, right? So the moral genealogies rejected, natural law or like objectivist accounts of morality, which maintained that morality was an objective a phenomenon which we can arrive at through reason. And the genealogists prefer to instead sort of trace how morality or moral concepts might develop um, among humans, given our sort of psychological and cultural inclinations. And Nietzsche, in many ways, saw the power of this genealogical approach to morality, and in many ways supported it. But he also took a lot of issues with what moral genealogists concluded before the writing of this text. In the first essay, Good and Evil, Good and Bad, which we did not read for this course, but is important to briefly talk about because it sets up the second essay. So in this section, Nietzsche does a very similar move to Rousseau, in which he considers a state of affairs or state of nature, if you like, even though Nietzsche doesn't necessarily use the term state of nature, but to a hypothetical state of affairs to which there are two alternative moral valuations that emerged in history. Nietzsche didn't think that concepts, especially moral concepts, have one uniform meaning, right? He thought that concepts like good and evil or good and bad have a history, and they're not just granted to us, or they're not just given to us through reason, right? So the first set of moral values that Nietzsche discusses is this distinction between good and bad. So under this rubric, what is good is that which is strong, dominant, and noble. And what is bad is that which is weak, poor, and lowly. And Nietzsche identifies this way of moral thinking with sort of various aristocratic and noble groups in history, right? Which he calls a master morality. And throughout his writings, he uses some sort of examples of people that might have had this morality, including the Romans, the samurai from Japan, or here the Aryans, quote unquote, of the Indo-European steppes. So, in this case, you can see how the Nazis misread Nietzsche. At the core of master morality is this idea that, what is good is that which is strong, again, which is noble, which is dominant. And, to be good is to not be these other things that are the opposite of what is strong, dominant, noble, namely what is weak, poor, and lowly. And the second set of values that he discusses is the difference between good and evil. Now, according to this view, what is good is the opposite from master morality, right? Because in this case, what is good is that which is weak, poor, and lowly. And what is evil is what the aristocrats consider to be good, which is that which is strong, dominant, and noble. So Nietzsche refers to this way of thinking morally as a slave morality because it's a slavish or lowly way of moral thinking. And in Nietzsche's account, he attributes the development of slave morality to the development of Judeo-Christian values. So from the development of Judaism and then eventually, which was reformed into Christianity, had this moral view of the world is that, God blesses those who are meek, God blesses those who are humble, and poor, and God will eventually smite and punish those who are strong, dominant, and loyal. And in his other writings, he also kind of attributes slave morality in Eastern societies to the development of Buddhism, which sort of has a similar moral system to Christianity, according to Nietzsche. Um, for Nietzsche, slave morality is driven by what he calls ressentiment, and most people preserve the original French. Nietzsche was a German writer, but he uses this French term, ressentiment, which has the insinuation of resentment, but it goes a little bit deeper than just mere resentment. And ressentiment is this deep hatred that someone has for themselves and this deep envy that they have for others. But instead of just kind of admitting to that, they project that deep sense of self-hatred and envy into something that is allegedly bigger than them. It's like morality, right? So, in the case of so-called slave morality, those who are oppressed and those who are weak, they actually just hate themselves because they are weak and they're oppressed, and they envy the aristocrats. They envy those who dominate them. But instead of just kind of coming to terms with that, they want to say, oh, well, actually, I'm the good one. I'm the one that's noble. I'm the one that's going to go to heaven, right? And you're the one that's evil. So the sense of ressentiment really for Nietzsche creates this very complex internal life within the life of those who are oppressed. However, though, it's important to know that Nietzsche isn't saying, oh, master morality is better. We need to go back to master morality. For Nietzsche, he thinks that a lot of this process is irreversible. And, those who had a master morality suffer from their own short sights, right? And one of them is that those who have so-called slave morality, those who have ressentiment, I'm sorry, eventually became a little bit more clever than the masters, especially a group of these people he calls the priestly class, who come from the sort of these oppressed, weak peoples, right? And they're more clever because they found a way to gain social and political power, and found a way to eventually overthrow master morality by these very clever kind of ways that don't just rely on direct strength and power, right? And they're called the priestly class because again, they come from the most intelligent sections of the oppressed population. But instead of just conquering the masters and becoming the new masters, they want to completely subvert our moral system in a way. And again, he attributes this to the development of Judeo-Christian morality. So now that we get to the second essay, Nietzsche wants to consider, the development of moral concepts like guilt, bad conscience, and the like. And for Nietzsche, he goes against the dominant consensus within moral genealogy at the time, moral philosophy at the time. That a lot of our moral conscience or moral intuition are more or less given, right? That humans just kind of have a natural propensity to be responsible. Humans just have a natural propensity for wanting to correct or wanting to right wrongs. For Nietzsche, though, he thinks that the development of what we call a quote unquote moral conscience is actually the product of a long and painful history of violence and torture. It's not something that's given, it's something that has a very deep history. So, for example, he writes that moral concepts originated as a means to, quote, breed an animal with the prerogative to promise. So what does this mean? Well, take the concept of responsibility. Responsibility is this idea that we should all be mutually responsive or beholden to others. And for Nietzsche, he traces this concept of responsibility to, quote, make man a certain degree necessary, uniform, a peer amongst peers, orderly, and consequently predictable, unquote. And to do this, you have to accomplish two things to breed this animal that you call the human, to be consistent, to be predictable, to be responsible. And the one is through memory, or what he calls mnemotechnics, right? So techniques of memory. So the idea is that, the prerogative to be responsible or good, has to be burned into our memories through both psychological and physical torture. Again, for Nietzsche, we're not just born innately as a species to be quote unquote responsible, right? The development of responsibility or responsible humans comes about through this long history of psychic and physical torture, which we'll get into here in a second. And the second thing that needs to be accomplished is a mass forgetting or forgetfulness. So not only do we have to have uh, the memory to be good or responsible burned into our memories, we also have to be made to forget certain drives, instincts, and wills within us that go contrary to being uniform or predictable animals with the right to make promises. So by that token, Nietzsche writes that memory and forgetfulness are two sides of the same coin. When we memorize, we are forgetting something. When we forget, we are opening up the space or tabula rasa to memorize new things. So he has this quote here, quote, through things like stoning, quartering, impaling, boiling, flailing, tarring, etc. Okay, here's the real quote. That was a sort of paraphrase on my part. Quote, man was eventually able to retain 5 or 6 I don't want tos in his memory, in connection with which a promise had been given, in order to enjoy the advantages of society. And there you are. With the aid of this sort of memory, people finally came to reason. Reason, somnity, mastering of emotions, this really dismal thing called reflection, all these privileges and splendors man has. What price had to be paid for them? How much blood and horror lies at the basis of all good things, unquote. Um, so Nietzsche writes that the ultimate product or the ripest fruit, in his words, of this long history of bloodletting and moral inculcation is this idea of the sovereign individual. Now, when he writes about the sovereign individual, or the term sovereign individual might seem like a good thing, but for Nietzsche, it's not. And you can think of the sovereign individual as basically Kant's enlightened man, which we talked about a couple lectures ago. And again, for Kant, what it means to be someone who's an enlightened, autonomous person is someone who can impose their own moral customs, or they can impose their own moral law through the categorical imperative, through the use of their own reason, right? So instead of relying on these external authorities, instead of relying on the moral laws of other people, you can for yourself develop your moral system, but that moral system is true and universal across all possible worlds, right? It should be true for everyone else that is also a reasonable autonomous person. So Kant that this is just malarkey, right? So contra Kant, Nietzsche thought, the development of what we would call autonomous, reasonable, moral conscience is not a product of this nebulous reason. It's a product of, again, cruelty. Um, and Nietzsche expounds on this point by writing that, morality developed essentially from this creditor-debtor relationship. So a debtor is someone who owes money to the creditor, and creditor is the person who is due that money or good or whatever. It doesn't have to be money necessarily. So, when humans start to confederate into these villages or, communities, people begin to measure themselves against others. And through that mutual measurement, people start to create a sense of mutual responsibility, again, that term responsibility, and obligations that we have toward each other. Or, a network of contractual relations, as Nietzsche would write. So the idea that was that if the debtor fails, to pay their debts to the creditor, then, the creditor would have the right to essentially maim, torture, and punish the debtor for their own amusement until they believe that the debt has been paid through that torture. Here, Nietzsche traces, again, Nietzsche has having a philological training. Nietzsche traces the concept of guilt to the sense of indebtedness, right? We feel guilty when we feel indebted to others. But, in prehistoric times, Nietzsche uses the term prehistoric here in a very specific sense. But prehistoric times, this guiltiness, right, meant that I don't want to be tortured because if I don't pay my debts, then, my creditor is going to whip me, is going to break my back on the rack, is going to do all these horrible things until they're satisfied that I paid my end of the bargain. But eventually, through history, once we've begun to inculcate this sense of moral conscience, quote unquote, that sense of guilt has been burned into our memories, and we associate this feeling that if we don't act morally, if we don't act good, if we don't end up our end of the social contract, if we don't end up our end of the moral system, then we should be guilty because then we are indebted to other people. So Nietzsche writes, quote, in this sphere of legal obligations, then, the moral conceptual world of debt, conscience, duty, sacred duty, has its breeding ground, all began with a thorough and prolonged bloodletting, like the beginning of all great things on earth, to the degree that to make someone suffer is pleasure in its highest form, and to the degree that the injured party received an extraordinary counter pleasure in exchange for the injury and distress caused by the injury. To make someone suffer, a true feast, something that, as I mentioned, rose in price the more it contrasted with the rank and social position of the creditor. Um, so Nietzsche really here touches on a very, disturbing aspect of human nature, so to speak, right? Is that, humans, we're not always these innocent sort of people that, live in harmony with each other, like Rousseau would have us believe, for instance, right? Um, and even unlike Hobbes, humans aren't just these, constantly fearful, insecure people in a state of war against all, trying to find peace. Humans have this other dimension within them, is that we have this capacity to enjoy cruelties that we inflict against other people, right? Um, and so for Nietzsche, that's the development of morality. Morality, well, at least Judeo-Christian morality, or the sort of mass morality, right? Doesn't really have this innocent history. It has this history of violence and bloodshed. So in that sense, he's similar to Marx in that he wants to interrogate the origins of these concepts that we take for granted. But obviously, unlike Marx, he goes in a different direction. Okay. So now we get Thus Spoke Zarathustra, which is the second reading that we attached to Nietzsche. And Thus Spoke Zarathustra, as you might have noticed, is a work of philosophical fiction that explores many themes within Nietzsche's own philosophy. So it's a book where, through this character of Zarathustra, he kind of explores his own ideas about things like morality, even his political philosophy, his ethical system, his idea of the eternal recurrence, et cetera, et cetera. Zarathustra was actually originally a prophetic figure adapted from this ancient Iranian religion known as Zoroastrianism. And Nietzsche adapts Zarathustra to symbolize a sense of spiritual renewal, right? But also it's kind of a play on irony because the original Zarathustra, preached about the metaphysical struggle between good and evil. In many ways, Zoroastrianism was a precursor to other religions that had similar worldviews, like Judaism or Christianity. But Nietzsche's Zarathustra, on the other hand, wants to overcome good and evil by creating a new set of values for those who transcend humanity. That is the Übermensch, which we'll get into here in a couple seconds. So in the opening, in the prologue of Thus Spoke Zarathustra, he talks about Zarathustra, finally coming down from his years of living in isolation, reflecting on his own spiritual life. And eventually, when he's coming down from the mountain, excited to share the new wisdom that he has accrued, he encounters this saint, this priest of God, who beckons Zarathustra to, turn around, to not interact with humans because humans are sinful, awful creatures, and that the only way to live a life is to praise God and to wait for the afterlife, for heaven. And Nietzsche, and Zarathustra, kind of is amused by this, but is also disturbed because he writes, doesn't the saint not know that God is dead? This idea of the death of God is a very central and recurrent theme within Nietzsche's philosophy. And the idea here is that, with the advancement of science and humanistic ideas, for example, with the scientific revolution or the Enlightenment or its afterlives, these things made it such that, God is no longer a reckoning force of people. God is no longer a reckoning force in people's moral lives. So again, the idea is that, before all of these advancements, philosophical and scientific advancements, God was an indispensable organizing concept or organizing principle within people's moral systems and people's social lives. But when you start to erode that, and that starts to become deteriorated, well, then it creates this crisis of meaning. So with the death of God, people, especially people in Europe at this time, were led to this state of nihilism. And nihilism is this idea more or less is this idea that you lack a sense of ultimate purpose in life. And for Nietzsche, he thought that this was a very can be a potentially very productive moment for European culture, but it could also be a very dangerous moment for European culture. Because in this crisis of meaning, you have all these different worldviews that start to pop up and try to take the place of what was once belief in God. So for Nietzsche, he thought that we needed to both embrace and overcome nihilism through a transvaluation of values. So in this moment of nihilism, in this crisis of meaning, we have the opportunity to reflect on the moral concepts and moral commitments that defined our culture for the past several centuries, and to completely redefine it toward a more creative and toward a more affirmative, life affirmative direction. So Nietzsche, took a lot of issue with Christianity because he thought that it was, quote, a cult of death, right? Because Christianity teaches people to, reject this world as sinful and to basically live their life preparing for the afterlife, which ostensibly or allegedly will be better than this one. And Nietzsche thought that this was a cult of death because it leads you to neglect or to reject the wonder that is the human life. And you're basically living a life where you're just trying to expedite your own death in the service of this afterlife, in the service of this God, right? So Nietzsche's answer to this death of God or to this crisis of meaning is the Übermensch, which is translated into English as the Overman or the Superman. And the Übermensch is expressed in this metaphor of the tightrope walker, right? Where the tightrope walker is walking on this tightrope, where the building behind him represents humans or man, right? And then he's walking towards the Übermensch. And the journey to becoming the Übermensch is very dangerous, is a very potentially deadly process that doesn't always end in success, as in the case of the tightrope walker. And here, the concept of the Übermensch was appropriated by the Nazi Party to have this sort of racial connotation of referring to a specific group of people, in this case being the so-called Aryan race, right? But for Nietzsche, his idea of the Übermensch didn't refer to a specific race of people or to a specific group of people in this kind of biologically deterministic way. For Nietzsche, the Übermensch were these group of people who doesn't really matter what race you are. It's these group of people who are able to overcome conventional morality and to live a affirming and creative life. So in the three metamorphoses, which is the last part of the piece that you read for us, he also has this narrative or allegory of the three phases of or the three metamorphoses, which represent the three phases of spiritual transformation on this journey of transvaluating values. So the first metamorphosis you have is the camel. And the camel are those who have a spirit that is burdened by conventional morality and guilt, right? And they find their sense of spiritual nourishment from established norms and notions of the good life. And Nietzsche writes about how the camel, just like how the camel drinks water no matter where the water source comes from, people who have the spirit of a camel don't have the courage to sort of question their own preconceptions about the good life or morality. Instead, they just sort of follow the dictates of what is already established by the herd, the masses, the common people. The second metamorphosis is the lion. Now, the lion exhibits this courage because the lion is willing to reject conventional morality. In so doing, the lion is able to destroy these established norms, right? So unlike the camel, the lion has this sense of moral or transvaluative courage that the camel simply lacks. But the problem with the lion is that the lion is only really able to just destroy and negate and subvert things, but it's unable to fundamentally recreate or redefine for itself its own moral values. And so the final metamorphosis, which Nietzsche thinks should be the ultimate aspiration of the Übermensch, or those who transcend humanity, is to become the child or a child in this metaphorical sense, of course. The child is characterized by this playfulness or creativeness because they're unburdened by established norms and conventions because again they already questioned it and they already destroyed it. But now that they're destroyed all their preconceived notions of the good life, now they're in a situation where they can kind of experiment and play around and be creative. Um, and for Nietzsche, we ultimately should aspire to be the child and to not fall prey to established norms, not fall prey into mass thinking, but to try to reflect on the values that dictate our lives and to redefine them.